The candlelight flickers against the vellum, casting long, skeletal shadows that dance like the ghosts of the dispossessed. To understand the blade, one must first understand the silence that precedes it. In the year of our Lord 1342, in the frost-rimed valleys of the Upper Rhine, the law was not merely a set of words whispered in courts, it was the weight of iron and the absence thereof. The village of Oakhaven smelled of damp wool, peat smoke, and the metallic tang of oncoming snow. It was a place where time did not flow, it pooled, stagnant and gray. At the edge of this stillness lived Elian, a man whose hands were mapped with the calluses of a woodcutter, not the scars of a duelist. Yet, beneath the floorboards of his hut, wrapped in oil-soaked linen, lay a length of steel that the law forbade him to touch. In the medieval soul, the sword was more than a weapon, it was a vertical prayer, a cruciform of authority. To carry it without the seal of nobility was not merely a crime of property, but a theological transgression. It was an act of umphin and upsetting of the natural order where the shepherd pretends to be the wolf. The king and his lords claimed the monopoly on violence as a divine mandate, believing that if every peasant clutched a hilt, the very fabric of the celestial spheres would unravel into chaos. Elian sat by his hearth, the fire dying into embers that glowed like the eyes of a cornered beast. He felt the cold creeping through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls. Outside, the world was a vast, indifferent cathedral of ice. To hold a sword is to hold the power to end time for another. And when the powerless reach for time, the powerful see it as a theft of eternity itself. The sound of the village at night was a symphony of small, fragile things, the shifting of cattle and the byproduct of their own heat, the rhythmic cough of a sickly child 3 huts away, and the relentless, soft thud of snow falling from pine branches. Elian's fingers ached. The dampness had settled into his joints, a reminder of a life spent bowing to the earth to coax a living from it. He thought of the sword. It was a simple arming sword, rusted at the crossguard, one from a dying mercenary in a ditch years ago. To the law, Elian was a non-free, a tethered soul. His freedom was measured by the length of his shadow, and his safety was a gift from a lord who lived in a stone fortress 3 leagues away, a lord who had not been seen in the village for 2 winters. The isolation of the medieval winter was not just physical, it was a spiritual vacuum. Without the permission to defend oneself, one's body becomes the property of the wind and the predator. The prohibition of the sword was the ultimate isolation, it stripped a man of his agency, leaving him a ghost in his own life, waiting for a permission that would never come. The air in the hut grew thin. Elian closed his eyes and could almost smell the sword through the floorboards, the sharp, acidic scent of the old grease, the cold, dead smell of the metal. It smelled of a different world, a world of movement and defiance. In those days, the law argued that peace was maintained by the inequality of arms. If the peasant were armed, he might mistake his hunger for justice. The Pax Urbana required the commoner to be soft so that the state could be hard. But as the wind howled through the eaves, sounding like a choir of the damned, Elian wondered if the peace of the Lord was merely the silence of the grave. He reached down, his fingers brushing the cold dirt of the floor. He did not dig. Not yet. The fear was a physical presence, a layer of soot on his skin. To be caught with the iron was to face the bloodgericht, the blood court. The punishment was not merely death, but the erasure of one's labor, the burning of one's home, the scattering of one's lineage. Is a man truly alive if he cannot choose the manner of his passing? The medieval mind wrestled with the concept of fortuna, the great wheel that turns regardless of merit. But the sword was an attempt to jam the wheel. By forbidding the blade, the masters of the world were attempting to keep the wheel turning in their favor. Time, in the darkness of Elian's hut, felt like a heavy shroud. Every minute spent in submissive silence was a minute stolen from his soul. We often think of freedom as a grand declaration, but in the 14th century, it was found in the grip of a hilt. It was the ability to stand between one's family and the encroaching dark and say, no further. Yet, the church preached that the meek would inherit the earth. They failed to mention that the earth they inherited was usually the 6 feet piled above them. Faith was a comfort, but iron was a fact. Elian stood and walked to the window, peering through the oiled parchment that served as a pane. He saw the silhouettes of the village, huddled, shivering, and silent. He heard the distant howl of a wolf, a sound that sliced through the night like a razor. The wolf did not need permission. The storm did not need a seal. Only the human, the image of God, was required to be helpless. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of bitterness, a taste like copper in the back of his throat. The injustice was not just in the hunger or the cold, but in the enforced fragility of his existence. The sword beneath the floor was a secret sun, radiating a dangerous, forbidden heat. It promised a different kind of death, not the slow rot of the serf, but the sudden, bright spark of the rebel. As the first part of our chronicle draws to a close, we find Elian standing in the center of his small world, caught between the law of men and the instinct of the living. The candle is a nub of tallow now, drowning in its own melted heart. The tragedy of the forbidden sword was not that it caused violence, but that its absence codified a permanent state of victimhood. To be denied the blade was to be told that your life was not worth the metal required to save it. It was a profound loneliness, a separation from the very concept of self-preservation. Elian knelt. He began to scrape away the earth. The sound of his fingernails against the frozen dirt was the sound of a man digging his own grave, or perhaps, finally, digging his way out of a tomb he had inhabited since birth. The bitter truth remained: the law protects the sheep only so that they may be shorn by the rightful hand. The dirt was cold, a stubborn, frozen crust that fought against his blunt fingernails. Elian worked in the rhythmic, hollow silence of a man committing a sin he had already forgiven himself for. There is a specific sound to earth being moved in the dead of night, a wet, tearing noise that feels loud enough to wake the saints in their stone niches. Each handful of soil he tossed aside felt like a year of his life being discarded. As the linen wrapping finally appeared, the air in the hut seemed to thicken with the scent of old iron and anticipation. When he pulled the object from its grave, the weight of it surprised him. It was not the weight of a tool, like his axe or his hoe, which pulled toward the earth to serve it. This weight was centered, balanced, and defiant. It was a weight designed to extend the reach of a human arm into the space of another's soul. He unwrapped the cloth, and the faint, gray moonlight filtered through the parchment window to catch the dull glimmer of the blade. It was not a king's sword. It was nicked along the foible, and the leather of the grip was dark with the ancient sweat of a man long since returned to dust. To the law of the land, this piece of metal was a ban, a forbidden thing. In the medieval mind, objects held a sort of moral resonance. A chalice was holy because of what it held, a sword was noble because of who was permitted to wield it. For Elian to hold this was a form of spiritual theft. It was as if he had reached up and plucked a star from the sky to light his own fire. The silence of the village pressed against the walls of his hut. He wondered if his neighbors, huddled under their thin blankets, could sense the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Could they smell the rebellion? The law against carrying a sword was not merely about preventing murder, it was about the architecture of fear. A man who cannot defend himself must always be looking for a protector, and a man who is always looking for a protector is a man who can be easily ruled. By holding the hilt, Elian was cutting the invisible threads of patronage that kept him tethered to the Lord's land. He ran a thumb along the flat of the blade. It was freezing, a sliver of the absolute zero that exists between the stars. He thought of the concept of pax quiescent, the quiet peace. The church taught that peace was the absence of strife, but as the metal chilled his blood, Elian realized that the peace he had lived in was merely a long, slow surrender. True peace, perhaps, required the potential for storm. What is a man without the means to say no? He is a beast of burden, a seasonal calculation, a decimal in a ledger. The sword was the grammar of no. It was the only word that the stone castle on the hill truly understood. Elian felt a strange, terrifying heat rising in his chest, a counterfire to the winter outside. It was the heat of dignity, a flame that burns most fiercely when it is most illegal. The wind rattled the door, a sudden, violent shake that made Elian freeze, the sword clutched to his chest like a secret child. He held his breath. The sound of his own heart was a drum in the small space, a frantic, rhythmic reminder that he was still meat, still bone, still mortal. If the Voigt the bailiff were to walk in now, Elian's life would be over before the sun touched the horizon. They would not just hang him, they would desecrate the very memory of him. To carry the sword was to claim a status he had not inherited, a crime more heinous than simple theft. It was a crime against the Ordo Mundi, the order of the world. He sat back on his heels, the sword resting across his knees. The darkness of the room seemed to expand, stretching into the corners of history. He thought of the thousands of men like him, whose names had been swallowed by the mud, who had lived and died without ever feeling the cold reassurance of steel. Was their silence a virtue, or was it a tragedy? Time in the Middle Ages was measured by the bells of the monastery, a communal time that belonged to God and the Church. But sitting there, Elian discovered a private time. A time that belonged only to him and the blade. In this private time, the feudal world did not exist. There was no lord, no tithe, no corvée labor. There was only the gravity of the metal and the reach of his own will. But the smell of the damp earth remained, a reminder of where all men, armed or unarmed, eventually go. Death is the ultimate equalizer, the great deriser who laughs at the golden spurs of the knight and the wooden clogs of the peasant. Yet, there was a difference. The knight died with a signature in his hand, the peasant died as an anonymous harvest. Elian looked at the sword and saw a pen. He saw a way to sign his own name upon the world, even if that signature was written in blood and erased by the next rain. The candle gave one final, desperate flicker and died, leaving him in a darkness so absolute it felt physical. He could no longer see the sword, but he could feel it. It was a cold line of truth in a world of shadows. He realized then that he could never put it back. You cannot unknow the feeling of power. You cannot unbreathe the air of a free man. He thought of the morning to come. The village would wake to the same gray light, the same hunger, the same demands. But he would be different. He would be a walking contradiction, a peasant with the soul of a sentinel. The isolation he felt now was no longer the isolation of the victim, but the isolation of the initiate. He had entered a brotherhood of the damned, those who chose the danger of the edge over the safety of the yoke. As he sat there in the dark, the first hint of a wolf's howl drifted from the ridge. Usually, that sound brought a shiver of helplessness. Tonight, Elian's hand tightened on the grip. The leather creaked, a small, sharp sound of defiance. He found himself smiling, a grim, bitter expression that no one would ever see. The beauty of the sword was not in its use, but in its presence. It was a silent companion in a world that had tried to leave him utterly alone. The history of the world is often written as a series of great battles and treaties, but the true history of humanity is written in the quiet moments of the oppressed, in the dark huts where men decide that they are no longer afraid. Elian knew that this path led to a scaffold. He knew that the iron would eventually betray him, for iron has no loyalty to those who are not its masters. But for this one night, the power was his. The snow began to fall more heavily outside, muffling the world, burying the paths, turning the valley into a white, silent tomb. Inside, Elian waited for the dawn, his fingers tracing the nicks in the steel, wondering how many men had died to give this blade its story, and how much his own story would cost when the bill finally came due. The price of a sword, he realized, was never paid in coin, it was paid in the terrifying, beautiful currency of a shortened life. The dawn did not break, it merely dissolved the darkness into a bruised, oppressive gray. Elian stood by his small hearth, the sword now hidden not beneath the earth, but beneath the heavy weave of his woolen tunic, held against his ribs by a fraying rope belt. The metal was a cold brand against his skin, a constant, biting reminder of his heresy. Every step he took felt weighted, not by the iron itself, but by the invisible gaze of the law that seemed to permeate the very mist clinging to the thatched roofs of Oakhaven. He stepped outside, and the air tasted of frozen needles. The village was stirring, the sound of a shutter banging, the low, mournful lowing of a cow whose udder was tight with milk and cold. To his neighbors, Elian was still the woodcutter, a man of bowed head and silent tongue. But as he walked toward the communal well, he felt a strange, jagged disconnect. He was seeing the world through the slit of a helmet that wasn't there. He noticed the soft throats of the men, the unprotected reach of the bailiff's back as he shouted orders near the tithe barn. The sword had changed his eyes before it had ever tasted blood. This was the hidden poison of the forbidden blade, it granted a perspective that made communal life impossible. To carry a concealed weapon is to live in a state of perpetual ambush. The Trugadé, the truce of God, was supposed to protect the unarmed, but Elian now saw it as a transparent veil. He realized that the peace of the Middle Ages relied entirely on the assumption that the sheep would never imagine themselves with teeth. He watched the bailiff, a man named Heward, whose fur-lined cloak smelled of stale ale and authority. Heward carried a short mace at his hip, a blunt instrument of the Lord's will. In the eyes of the law, that mace was a sacred scepter. In the eyes of the hidden steel against Elian's ribs, it was merely a piece of wood and tin. Authority is a ghost that haunts the mind until it is confronted by the physical reality of resistance. Then, it is revealed to be nothing more than a man with a louder voice and a better-fed horse. The morning progressed with a grueling, repetitive slowness. Elian was sent to the high ridge to clear the deadfall from the recent storm. The work was meant to be mindless, a tax of sweat paid to the manor. But today, every swing of his axe felt like a rehearsal. He felt the phantom length of the sword in his mind, comparing the wooden haft to the iron tang. He was no longer working for the Lord, he was maintaining the vessel of a rebel. As the sun reached its zenith, a pale, heatless disk behind the clouds, the silence of the woods was broken by the jingle of harness and the rhythmic thud of hooves. It was a patrol of the Lord's men-at-arms, 3 riders in gambesons of boiled leather, their faces obscured by the shadows of their kettle hats. They rode with the casual arrogance of those who own the air they breathe. Elian dropped his gaze, as was required. He felt the sweat cooling on his neck, turning to ice. One of the riders stopped, his horse blowing plumes of steam that smelled of oats and fermented grain. The soldier looked down at Elian, not as a man, but as a feature of the landscape, like a stump or a stone. "You there," the soldier barked, his voice cracking the stillness. "Have you seen any stragglers? There are rumors of deserters from the southern wars hiding in these breaks." Elian's heart hammered against the hidden hilt. The iron seemed to hum, a low vibration that surely the soldier could hear. If he were searched, the story would end here, in the mud, with a short rope and a long drop. The fear was a cold sludge in his veins, but beneath it was a new, terrifying spark of contempt. He realized that the only thing standing between him and the soldier's throat was a thin layer of wool and a massive, collective lie. "No, Messera," Elian muttered, his voice raspy from the cold. "Only the wind and the crows." The soldier lingered, his eyes scanning the clearing. He adjusted his sword belt, a heavy, gilded thing that clattered with a sound of supreme confidence. That sound was the music of the era, the clatter of the armed over the silence of the disarmed. It was the sound of a world where right was a matter of reach. The patrol moved on, the sound of their departure fading into the muffled embrace of the snow. Elian stood trembling, his hand instinctively reaching through his tunic to grip the hidden leather of his own hilt. He felt a sickening sense of vertigo. He had survived, but he had lost his place in the world. He was no longer a part of the village, nor was he a part of the nobility. He was a creature of the threshold, a ghost haunting the machinery of the state. He thought of the concept of libertas, freedom. To the monks, it was the freedom from sin. To the lords, it was the freedom to tax. But to Elian, in that frozen clearing, freedom felt like a terrible isolation. It was the knowledge that he was now entirely responsible for his own skin. The protective shadow of the Lord had vanished, replaced by the cold, hard weight of self-reliance. Is a soul truly free if it must hide its essence to survive? The sword was his truth, yet it forced him into a life of absolute deception. He was a prisoner of his own liberation. He looked at his hands, red, cracked, and dirty, and wondered if they were already stained with the blood of the man he used to be. The woodcutter was dead, the secret-bearer had been born in the dark, and the world had no name for such a thing. The shadows began to lengthen, stretching across the snow like the fingers of a reaching god. Elian gathered his wood, but his mind was elsewhere, wandering through the corridors of a future he could no longer predict. He understood now why the sword was forbidden. It wasn't just to prevent violence, it was to prevent the common man from realizing that the world is made of wax, and that iron can reshape it. He started the long walk back to the village, the sword heavy against his side, a secret heartbeat that promised both a beginning and an end. The snow began to fall again, white and indifferent, covering his tracks as if he had never been there at all. In the distance, the monastery bell began to toll for vespers, a sound of ancient, rhythmic order that felt, for the first time in his life, like a lie. The sword was no longer a tool, it had become a parasite. It lived against Elian's ribs, feeding on his peace, demanding a vigilance that eroded the marrow of his soul. In the village of Oakhaven, where every man's business was as transparent as the thin gruel in his bowl, a secret was a physical deformity. People began to look at Elian differently, sensing a change in the frequency of his silence. He moved with a new, strange grace, the cautious, balanced gait of a man who carries a hidden weight. One evening, as the violet bruised the horizon and the smell of roasting turnips drifted from the communal kitchen, Elian's sister, Martha, came to his hut. She brought a small loaf of rye bread, its crust blackened by the soot of the oven. She sat by his fire, her hands tucked into her sleeves, her eyes tracing the lines of tension in his face. In a world of shared poverty, the greatest luxury is privacy, and the greatest threat is a brother who no longer looks his sister in the eye. "The village is talking, Elian," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the crackle of the greenwood. "They say you walk like a man who has found gold in the forest. They say you look at the bailiff's men as if you are measuring them for a shroud." Elian did not answer. He felt the cold touch of the pommel against his skin. To speak of the iron was to invite her into his treason. The medieval family was a singular unit of liability. If one limb withered, the whole body was cast into the fire. By keeping his silence, he was attempting to keep her safe, yet the silence itself was a wall of ice between them. "There is a darkness in you," she continued, her voice trembling. "A sharpness. It is not the sharpness of an axe, brother. It is the sharpness of a needle. It pricks everyone who comes near you. True isolation is not being alone in a room. It is being surrounded by those who love you while harboring a truth that would destroy them if whispered." Martha reached out to touch his arm, and Elian flinched. The movement was instinctive, the flinch of a warrior protecting his flank, but to Martha, it was a rejection. The hurt in her eyes was a different kind of blade, one that his iron could not parry. He realized then that the law's prohibition of the sword was a masterstroke of psychological control. It didn't just disarm the hand, it poisoned the heart. To be the only one with a weapon in a room of the defenseless is to become a stranger to your own kind. As the night deepened, a heavy, wet fog rolled in from the river, swallowing the village in a gray shroud. The sounds of the world became muffled, ghostly. Elian walked Martha to her door, his hand never straying far from the rope belt beneath his tunic. The fog smelled of ancient silt and rotting leaves, the scent of time itself. He stood in the center of the village square, alone. The church bell struck the hour of matins, a lonely, metallic clatter that seemed to mock his secret. He thought about the nature of the ordo, the divine order. The priest said that everyone had a place, the orators, those who pray, the bellators, those who fight, and the labrators, those who work. By carrying the sword, Elian had stepped out of his circle. He was no longer a laborer, but he could never truly be a fighter in the eyes of the world. He was a glitch in the cosmic clockwork. He looked up at the darkened windows of the huts. Inside, his friends and neighbors slept the heavy, exhausted sleep of the powerless. They were safe in their submissiveness. They did not have to worry about the rust on a blade or the glint of steel in the moonlight. For a moment, he envied them. He craved the simple, crushing weight of the yoke. Freedom, he discovered, was a cold and lonely heights, where the air was too thin to breathe comfortably. The sound of a distant horse's hoof against stone snapped him back to the present. He retreated into the shadows of an alleyway, his heart accelerating. In the dark, the sword felt like a living thing, a predator he had invited into his home. It promised protection, but it demanded everything else in return: his sleep, his trust, his connection to his people. He realized that the Lord did not need to hang him to destroy him. The mere existence of the sword was doing the work. It had turned his village into a forest of enemies and his sister into a stranger. The bitter irony was that the sword, designed to end a life quickly, was instead ending his life slowly, piece by piece, through the attrition of fear. He leaned his head against the damp wood of a granary wall. The smell of grain, dusty and sweet, reminded him of his childhood, of a time when the only thing he feared was the hunger of winter. Now, he feared the light. He feared the wind. He feared the very iron that was supposed to make him brave. The fog began to lift slightly, revealing the pale, skeletal outlines of the trees on the ridge. They looked like gallows, waiting. Elian straightened his tunic, adjusting the hidden burden that sat like a leaden weight against his heart. He understood now that the sword was not a shortcut to liberty. It was a mirror, and in it, he saw a man who had traded the comfort of a slave for the terror of a ghost. As he walked back to his hut, the first cock crowed a shrill, desperate sound that tore through the mist. It was a herald of a day he didn't want to face, a day where he would have to play the part of the woodcutter once more, while the iron tooth of the rebellion gnawed at his side. The path was narrowing. The time of hiding was coming to an end, and the time of the blade was drawing near, cold and inevitable as the winter frost. The crisis arrived not with a roar, but with the wet, rhythmic sobbing of a woman in the muddy track between the huts. It was midday, and the sky was the color of a guttering candle. A group of the Lord's younger retainers, men whose nobility was a thin veneer over a core of bored cruelty, had ridden into Oakhaven. They were not the official patrol, they were the wild hunt of the bored aristocratic youth, seeking sport where none was permitted to be found. They had cornered a young boy, the son of the village blacksmith, accusing him of startling a hawk. The boy cowered in the slush, his face a mask of terror, while a young man with a plumed cap circled him on a bay stallion. The air smelled of horse sweat, ozone, and the metallic, sharp scent of impending violence. The villagers watched from the shadows of their doorways, their faces pale and immobile, the masks of the disarmed. Elian stood at the edge of the square, his hand instinctively ghosting over the bulge beneath his tunic. The iron felt alive, a cold serpent coiled against his ribs, whispering of the lex talionis, the law of retaliation. He saw Martha in the crowd, her eyes wide, pleading with him through the distance. She knew. She saw the way his shoulders had squared, the way his feet had found the balance of a predator. One of the riders drew a riding crop, the leather whistling through the frigid air. The crack of it against the boy's shoulder was the sound of the old world asserting its dominance. In that moment, the philosophical weight of the sword shifted. It was no longer a burden of guilt, it was a burden of utility. To have the means to stop a blow and to remain still is a different kind of suicide, it is the death of the witness. Faith tells us to turn the other cheek, but the soul knows that some cheeks are turned only to be struck again. The silence of the good man is the anvil upon which the tyrant hammers his crown. Elian stepped forward. The movement was small, but in the stagnant air of the village, it felt like a mountain shifting. The lead rider turned his horse, his sneer deepening as he saw a mere woodcutter approaching. The rider did not see a man, he saw a statistical inevitability, a creature born to serve and die. Back to your hole, peasant, the rider spat, his hand moving to the hilt of his own gilded sidearm. Unless you wish to share the whelp's discipline. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elian felt the coldness of the world enter his marrow. He realized that the permission to carry a sword was not granted by a king, it was claimed by the heart. The law was a ghost, but the iron in his hand was the only god that mattered in this mud-slicked square. He reached into the folds of his tunic. The sensation was one of profound, terrifying clarity. As his fingers closed around the cold leather of the grip, the isolation of the last few weeks vanished. He was no longer a ghost among his people, he was the lightning rod for their collective fear. The sword came out not with a flourish, but with a heavy, grinding finality. The screech of the blade leaving its makeshift scabbard was a sound Oakhaven had not heard in a generation. It was the sound of a contract being torn in half. The riders froze. The bay stallion reared, sensing the sudden eruption of lethal intent. The villagers let out a collective, ragged gasp, a sound of both hope and a death knell. The rider in the plumed cap stared at the rusted, notched steel in Elian's hand. His face transitioned from arrogance to a hollow, echoing confusion. You carry the king's iron," he whispered, as if the very words were a blasphemy. Elian did not speak. He didn't need to. The sword was his tongue. He felt a strange, bitter beauty in the moment. He knew that by revealing the blade, he had signed his own execution warrant. He knew that by sundown, the bells would toll for him. But as he stood there, the weight of the sword finally feeling light, he realized he had never been more alive. He was no longer a laborator. He was a man who had chosen his own ending. The snow began to fall again, large, soft flakes that landed on the cold steel and did not melt. Time slowed, stretching each heartbeat into an eternity. Elian looked at the boy, who was now scrambling away, and then back at the rider. The choice was made. The isolation was over. The sword was out, and it would not return to the earth until it had paid the price of its awakening. The standoff in the square held the village in a fragile, crystalline grip. The young noble, his face pale as the winter moon, began to draw his own weapon, a fine, polished blade of Toledo steel that whispered of wealth and effortless lethargy. Beside him, his companions' horses shifted, their hooves churning the gray slush of Oakhaven into a dark, muddy slurry. The smell of the square changed, the scent of peat and damp wool was replaced by the ozone of impending mortality. Elian did not move. He felt the wind tugging at his hair, a cold, indifferent caress. He looked at the blade in his hand and felt a profound sense of pity for it. This iron had waited in the dark, under the weight of the world, only to be brought out for a moment of ruin. He realized that the sword was not a symbol of power, but a symbol of the end of things. To draw it was to step out of the cycle of growth and into the cycle of the scythe. "Drop it, churl," the noble commanded, though his voice lacked the steel of his station. "You have committed high treason. There is no mercy for a peasant who mimics a knight." Elian's response was a low, steady breath that clouded in the air. "The mercy was lost when you struck the boy," he said, his voice sounding to his own ears like stone grinding on stone. "I am not mimicking a knight. I am remembering a man." The first blow was not a grand display of fencing, it was a desperate, ugly collision. The noble spurred his horse, the beast's chest a wall of muscle and fur. Elian stepped aside, the movement as fluid as the water in the mountain streams he had cleared of ice since childhood. He swung the notched blade, not with the grace of the court, but with the brutal efficiency of a man who splits logs for a living. The sound of iron meeting iron was a dissonant, jarring scream that echoed off the stone walls of the church. The village watched in a paralysis of awe and horror. They were witnessing the impossible, the shattering of the invisible blast that separated the ground from the sky. Martha was weeping silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. She knew that even if Elian won this dance, he had already lost his life. The Lord's justice was a slow, grinding millstone, and it would not stop until it had reduced Oakhaven to dust to find the man who dared to be armed. As the second rider joined the fray, Elian felt a strange, detached peace. He saw the world in fragments, the glint of a silver buckle, the panicked eye of a horse, the way the snow settled on the noble's velvet collar. He realized that freedom is a flash, a brief, blinding spark between two darknesses. He had spent his life in the long, gray shadow of the first darkness, and now he was stepping into the second. But for this one moment, he was the light. He was struck by a mace from behind, a heavy, dull thud that sent him to his knees. The taste of copper filled his mouth, and the world tilted. He looked down at the mud. It was the same mud he had walked in every day of his life. It was the mud that would eventually take him back. He felt the cold iron of his sword still in his hand, a solid anchor in a dissolving world. He did not try to stand. He simply looked up as the riders circled him, their faces now masks of righteous fury. They were the law, and he was the transgression. They were the timekeepers, and he was the broken clock. The noble with the plumed cap raised his sword for the final stroke, the steel shimmering with the reflection of the dying sun. Death is not the enemy of the poor man. The enemy is the life that asks him to forget he has a soul. In the end, the length of the blade does not matter, only the height at which one holds it before the fall. The blade fell. It was a clean, swift arc that ended the rebellion and restored the silence. Elian's body slumped into the slush, his hand finally releasing the hilt. The sword lay beside him, already beginning to lose its heat to the frozen earth. The riders did not linger, they gathered their pride and rode out of the village, leaving the silence to heal over the wound they had left behind. The villagers did not move for a long time. They stared at the body of the woodcutter, the man who had dared to carry the iron. The snow began to cover him, a white, impartial shroud that didn't care about the laws of men or the sins of the heart. The sword, too, was slowly buried, its notched edge disappearing under the soft, cold flakes. The conclusion was bitter, as all truths are in a world built on the backs of the silent. Elian had achieved nothing that a ledger would record. The boy he saved would grow up in the same fear, the Lord would still demand his tithes, the winter would still be cold. Yet, there was a beauty in the ruin. For one afternoon, the village of Oakhaven had seen that the order of the world is a choice, not a destiny. The sword returned to the earth, not wrapped in linen this time, but as a part of the soil itself. It would rust and decay, joining the roots and the stones. And perhaps, centuries later, another man would dig in that spot and find a piece of twisted, ancient iron. He would wonder what it was, never knowing that he held the remains of a man's brief, illegal, and magnificent freedom. The candle in the historian's rune gutters and dies. The story is over, but the cold of the iron remains in the air, a reminder that some silences are louder than any shout, and some deaths are the only way to truly live.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.